Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual Author Talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott, your host for this series. I work for GPB, and I'm so pleased to talk tonight with Chad Sanders about his new book, Black Magic: What Black Leaders Learn from Trauma and Triumph. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There's a link in the chat that's on the right of your screen, and there's also a link provided at the History Center's website. Working at Google after graduating from Morehouse College, Chad tried to fit into its pervasive culture by wearing khakis and altering his speech and his musical interests. I remember the day I realized I couldn't play a white guy as well as a white guy, Chad writes. It felt like a death sentence for my career. But it was when he leaned into his authentic experience as a Black man that he began to thrive. And he recognized that there was magic in the skills and tactics and communal wisdom and faith that he learned growing up Black in America. Black magic. And he wondered if other people felt the same way. So Chad tells his own story and tests that proposition in this book. He interviews Black leaders in business and tech and science and creative fields about how they encountered and transcended social and structural racism on their path to success. It is not another book about racial reckoning or dismantling white supremacy, but unflinching individual accounts that provide a deep reservoir of power and transformation and examples of Black magic, and certainly a lot of conversation. And we hope that you will be part of that conversation tonight. So as Chad and I are talking, please do submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to try and get to as many as time allows. All right, here's our guest, Chad Sanders, a writer, director, actor, and musician based in New York City. I mentioned that he worked for Google, but he also worked for YouTube. And since leaving the tech track, he's written and co-written for TV and film and collaborated with the likes of Spike Lee, Morgan Freeman, and Will Packer. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, Slam, and Teen Vogue, among other places. And he is a former Atlantan. So, Chad, great to have you back, kind of, sort of, to Atlanta. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
So I definitely want to talk about the interviews that make up the bulk of the book. But I do want to start with your life and your experience, which your essays throughout the book, you're brought up in the DC area in Silver Spring. So can you tell us a little bit about that, growing up in really the suburbs?
Yeah, very much really the suburbs. I am from Silver Spring, Maryland, which I'd like to think of as its own thing, not contextualized by DC. Silver Spring is a pretty liberal sort of pocket of the DC metropolitan area. Many of the people that live there work in government jobs. It's middle class. My high school, middle school experiences were pretty white. Um, that was not because the schools that I went to weren't diverse, but because I was often in the gifted and talented programs at those schools, which are primarily comprised of white students. And that's for a bunch of reasons, but I think the most important reasons are that their parents advocate for them to be there, and that testing has some racial bias to it. But in any case, I ended up in those classes. And as a result, I had to learn to understand isolation very early in my life. I had to learn to understand that expressing myself and expressing my opinions as a Black person, even as a preteen and a teenager, was always going to be the work that I had to do on top of the schoolwork that the rest of us all had to do.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And that a lot of the people that you speak to talk about similarly having to straddle two worlds, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, I think are one of the expressions, and intuiting a kind of rules of engagement without being explicitly told what they were. So how did they talk about that, figuring all that out?
It's challenging. I think as early as you start to learn language, 2, 3, 4 years old, you pick up on the ways that people, or I know that I picked up on the ways that people defer to certain ways of speaking. I paid attention to in classes when the kids who spoke, the King's English raised their hands and had something to say, how the teachers responded to them versus when the kids who spoke in accents or broken English. I saw the difference in the ways that those types of kids were received by the teachers. And I think over time, I just empathically started to learn that if I wanted somebody to pay attention to what I had to say, if I wanted somebody to see me as a leader, see me as someone who was perceptive, someone who was interesting, I needed to be able to basically talk how white kids did, for lack of a better way to describe it. And that continued to be my experience all the way up until college, when I went to school where there were no white kids.
So different rules of engagement there altogether.
Sort of. The power of whiteness in this country is such that the rules can still find their ways into places where there are no white people. So even at Morehouse, I did recognize that my mastery of a certain way of speaking English did earn me a certain respect and deference from students in some environments. But at the same time, I think it made people also skeptical and second guessing of who I was, where I came from, what my own power allegiances were, and to not mince words, if I was trying to be white.
Yeah. Yeah. So after you left Morehouse, you landed an internship, I think, first at Google, and then a job at Google. You're working there in Silicon Valley. You go to London. You're in Rome. You're in Berlin. New York and Berlin. So how did that look there inside of a place where culture fit is one of the really prerequisites?
Yeah, so I did an intern at Google. It was my first job out of college, and
Okay.
I was 22. I went straight from the blackest place I'd ever been, maybe the blackest place on earth, which was the Atlanta University Center in the heart of West Atlanta, which is Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University, and Spelman College, the space that they all share there. So I went from somewhere that was so black and so diverse within blackness to living in Oakland, but commuting every day down to Mountain View, California, the area of Silicon Valley where Google's headquarters is, which was a very, very white place. And not just in that so many of the people that lived there were white, but there was something even sort of more poignantly white about the culture. And what I mean by that is it was a particular sort of whiteness. It was the sort of whiteness that votes Democrat, has very liberal sort of sensibilities, reads the New York Times and the New Yorker, has these opinions about how people should uplift and give opportunities to people who don't have them, but always with such theoretical applications. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of people who didn't have any black friends or black neighbors talking about how much they loved black people. And that in its own way can be very silencing of black people who are around. That in a way can make you feel even more invisible. And that's how I started to feel at times living there.
And you write about the pressure to fit in. You just start wearing check shirts and khakis and listen while people are talking about their international travel or family vacations or experiences. But what was the breaking point? When did that stop working for you?
Yeah, I think, it was death by a thousand cuts. So I'll choose a breaking point, but every decision I made to try to want what I thought my white colleagues wanted, or to try to be what I thought my white colleagues were, every one of those choices was painful in its own right. But I'll tell you something that I really had to eventually forgive myself for, was that I started intentionally separating myself from black people who I was friends with and who I knew, not just from my time there in Silicon Valley, but people that I'd known since college. And there weren't very many of us there. And so instead of sort of finding community and heart and love in the few of us that were there, I tried to jump ship on those folks and kind of close the door to the clubhouse behind me. And I wasn't even really safely in the clubhouse. And I think that's probably why I did that. But when I started to look at that behavior and really kind of reckon with it, which was, I don't know, I was probably 24, is when I realized that this has gone too far and I got to figure something else out here.
So what did you figure out? I mean, what worked?
I can't say actually that I figured it out so much as I just got tired of doing this act and not being that good at it. I think in the book I write, I couldn't play a white guy as well as a white guy. It's humiliating, to try to affect and change your interests and change how you talk and change what you like, and still sort of look around and realize that everyone can see you're an imposter. So I hit my head on that wall so many times that I gave up, and I almost like relaxed my shoulders and just started walking around as myself again. And my fear was that that was going to make me very lonely and that was going to make me an outcast. And to be honest, in some cases, I saw where Black and brown people had shown up more as themselves to work, not just at the company I was at, but at many companies. And they were outcast or not given the same sort of opportunities. And they did have struggles in that way. I think for me though, I just started to trust myself again. I started to trust my decisions. I started to trust how I saw the world, and I started to speak more boldly from that confidence. And it did really turn the axis, I wouldn't say in my favor, but I became a better employee. I became better at my job. And once I was good at my job, once I saw that I could kind of hang, then I started having thoughts about how can I take this value back for myself away from a corporation?
Yeah, and that's the kind of nut of the proposition of this book, that you started relying on the things that you grew up with, and the values of community and independent thinking and learning how, and perseverance, and the things that were experiences in your life growing up, and talk to all of these other people. I guess it was, you did talk to something like 200 people initially about this.
I started writing this book in 2017. It
Mhm.
obviously came out 2 days ago. I don't know if that's obvious, but it came out 2 days ago.
Congratulations.
So thank you. I appreciate it. So there, yeah, I mean, I had a lot of time to research for this thing, and I spoke to over 200 people about the premise, and 15 of those interviews made it into the book. And in my opinion, they were 15 of, I would say, probably the 20 best interviews. And what made the interviews that got in so good to me was that they were pretty fearless. I think, I spoke to people who had really strong opinions about this idea of black magic, but a lot of them weren't willing to go on the record because they didn't want to offend white people. They didn't want to offend neighbors. They didn't want to offend friends who they had been lying to because they felt uncomfortable speaking their truth. And these 15 people came in piping hot, ready to talk about the first time they went to a sleepover at a friend's house and the friend called them a nigger. The first time they tried to commit suicide because they lived in the Jim Crow South and it was too hard to have black skin there. Drug addictions that developed, getting fired, quitting, arguments with spouses and friends, and violence that occurred because people were having such a tough reckoning with who they were racially. So that was what I needed. I was the audience for the book. I was a young person in my mid 20s who wanted to be a CEO or an executive, or just like, I just wanted to be successful, really, to not overtalk it. And so I really went curiously to dig into these people's stories who had done big things, and they gave it, man. They gave it.
Yeah, it's incredible as a reader, certainly it's unflinching. They're very direct, and a number of people that you interviewed said things like, "I warped myself. I was suffocating." And we know that there are measurably different health outcomes for African Americans than the general population. The sheer stress of multi-generational inequality actually changes genetic makeup. And I wonder how people talked about that suppression of the self, how it worked on the body, how it worked
Yeah.
on your psyche.
That part was really striking to me. I should have known, but I guess I thought I was the only person who sometimes walks into a room full of people that look different from them and feels like I can't breathe. But to a person, I would say 80% of the interview subjects said something to the effect of, when I went to an HBCU, I felt for the first time like I could fully breathe deep breaths from my diaphragm. Or when I walked out of that building, when I left my job at that corporation, I felt like I could stand tall in my feet. I feel like I could feel the ground under me. It's like, we're not just talking about, this is not intellectualizing. This is not a book full of theory about how it feels to be a Black person or what it looks like or how to get through stuff. This is not, I read a lot of self-help books. I read a lot of Good to Great, 0 to 1, the 40-hour or the 4-hour work week, all that kind of stuff. I love that stuff. But it's very intellectualized. It lives in the head only. And these accounts were people talking about what they felt in their bodies as they move through the world in this way, both in joyful and in very scary and tragic ways.
Bunch of questions here. I want to start getting to them. Let's see. Dominique asks, how do you maintain the integrity of who you are and your unapologetic Blackness in the midst of predominant white space? Is it possible to do that long term without violating your integrity?
Man, the short answer is, well, there were two questions there. So the first answer I would say is I'm trying to figure that out now. There's such pressure always every day in my life, and I think in everyone's life, to contort themselves around societal norms. And those norms are generally set by white people. So they tell you to be a certain person and to want certain things. And I think where I got sort of, conflicted was trying to make myself want what somebody else wanted and then pursuing what somebody else wanted. And then day over day over day, you build up this irrational escalation of commitment to this thing that you don't even want. And meanwhile, the thing that I wanted the whole time was like trying to get my attention, which was eventually to do this job, which is writing. But for everybody, that's something different. But that want would show up it would be my first thoughts in the morning. It would be my last thoughts before I close my eyes at night, because I found ways to dull it throughout the entire day, or I had urgency for my job or for whatever I was doing that would dull it throughout the day. So I think the only way to try to get authentically into my body and stay there is to pay attention to what it is that I really want and seek that. And maybe that will keep me out of rooms I'm not supposed to be in, or maybe when I'm in rooms that I don't feel comfortable in, it'll stay with me. And I forgot what the other question was.
You know what I did too, and it disappears as soon as it gets asked. So I'm sorry about that to Dominique. But there are so many other things that we want to get to here, certainly. But this is something that you heard from a number of different people, that they learned how to code switch or shape shift, or being told, learning how to act white around white people, and also, like you talked about, a little bit of that discomfort of asking themselves whether they were Black enough, as one person put it, around Black people. So living this kind of racial duality, ghost chasing, as an executive coach, Ed Bailey, put it. But these are these are also useful adaptive responses or skills, right? If you're in a corporate context, Quincy Avery, he says, shape shifting taught me how to be fluid and function in NFL boardrooms and locker rooms. Jewel Burke Solomon said, this sharpened her ability to read a room. So what's that line between donning the mask and I'm killing this and self-betrayal?
Well, for one, it's confusing. Um, what we sometimes think is a necessary performance, in my opinion, it can often be us tricking ourselves into thinking that it's like what I said about pretending to act like a white guy. I don't think I was actually pulling off the performance. I think the things that probably endeared people to me were when my truth sort of snuck out of the sides of me that were trying, while I was trying to put on this performance. And I think if I can just like sort of lift up the structure of this whole thing, it's, when Quincy goes into that room to talk to the owner of an NFL team and he has to present himself a certain way, it's because that other guy has all the power and that other guy has the money and there's something Quincy needs from that dude. And that in itself is broken. If the only way to get someone to invest in your company or promote you or be a partner to you is to mirror them, is to be a reflection of themselves, that promotes narcissism. And that's really bad for all of us, I would say.
There are a couple questions here about corporate culture. Aaron asks, and Carla, I'm going to try and combine these two. How do you think larger companies like Google could try and address their diversity issues to make their environments more open and diverse to people without being superficial? Like the diversity training or cultural humility training. So recommendations for companies to truly be a place where people can bring their full self to work. What I heard from you just then is that the power structure is the thing that has to change. Is that something that companies can do by policy?
I'm going to say no, it's not. These companies are staffed by some of the smartest people in the world. They have budgets that are billions of dollars, many, many, many times over. They spend a lot of money on diversity trainings and diversity and inclusion workshops, and they have standalone diversity and inclusion departments within them. And yet the data shows that their proportions of Black and brown people remain dishearteningly low year over year. My point of view is that the problem is that these companies are actually just small groups of people who sit at the top of the org structures. They're the C-suite executives, they're the board, and they are the majority shareholders. And all those people, generally speaking, most of those people look alike. They have similar tastes, they vacation in the same places, they hang out, they're members of boards on other companies together. I was every time I do a talk with a big company about diversity and inclusion stuff, I go and research first to see who the people are in those seats, and you'd be surprised how much overlap they are across that group of people has across companies. So it's my opinion that the culture is set by those people, and the culture won't change until some of those people are replaced by people who look different from them. Mm-hmm. Everybody else underneath them is a steward of their will. That's it.
Besides the microaggressions at work and the pressure to conform, there are overt hostilities that people talk to you about in these interviews. And of course, the overarching disproportionate danger of being Black in America. Also, statistically, there's proximity to racialized trauma, and you hear some of these stories. But this book, I think, in the interviews, what comes across to me is like how it shapes a person, for better or for worse. And I wonder if you would read from Black Magic. This is about a trauma that you witnessed in high school. This was following a football game. So if you can set the story up for us a little and read from that.
Yeah, well, I am not prepared to read from it, but I can describe it.
Okay, good.
If that's okay.
That's fine.
So So I was at a high school football game. It was a normal Friday night. I was on the basketball team. We would go support the football players all together. We would show up. Our county at that point in time was, it looked and felt a lot like Friday Night Lights, the TV series. It was relatively diverse, but mostly white. And there was a string of 3 weeks where after each football game, some pretty massive fights would break out amongst some of the students, and they usually looked like me. Um, the third weekend of that series, a pretty gnarly brawl broke out right in front of the school, and about 15 feet away from me, uh, someone my age, a girl, was stabbed to death by another girl. And shortly thereafter, she was run over by a car. And I have already gotten texts and calls from friends who were standing there with me at that time who read that in the book. And it stayed with all of us. But what I remember from it is how sort of quickly we compartmentalized that moment and how we all went into school the next day and there was barely a mention of it. I had to go look up the incident on the Washington Post when I was writing the book just to make sure that I didn't imagine it. So therein was a lesson as I reflected on all this that Black kids in all environments, not just inner cities, not just impoverished areas, but certainly in those areas, but even where I grew up in middle class suburbs, we all live with this unusually urgent lifestyle where you realize that trauma and tragedy can strike at any second. And I think it makes us a little bit detached at times. It makes us develop this ability to move on from a really scary moment to the next moment. And as dark and as daunting as that is as an existence for young people, I do think it also gives us a skill set that we can apply in a lot of types of businesses, in many types of businesses that you need to be able to get from one urgent moment to another urgent moment with your whole self there presently so that you can focus.
Well, that's the thing that really strikes me about when you write about this, talking about the next day, you all go to school as if nothing had happened. So ignoring distress, which, as you said, it is a survival tactic in many ways. But this is the kind of dangers that your parents worked very hard to protect you from or isolate you from. Very careful rules, in your household, and of course the talk that every young Black American gets at the point where they're independent and could be in the line of sight or more interaction with police. And Ed Bailey talks about that. I think he had to be guarded and isolate himself from others in his own community for what felt like his own safety. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, this sort of tension between community and isolation, and what that means for trusting and building relationships over the long term.
Yeah, and just to be specific, every young Black person doesn't get that talk.
Yeah.
And I got it because, my dad gave it to me. Um, and if you don't have someone in your household to give you that talk, you are put at greater risk
Yeah.
because you're a kid and you just don't know. For me, to speak to my experience, that was my dad telling me no hats in the car, radio below a certain decibel level, only two friends, only me and one friend in the car at a time, because you don't want the police to have any reason to pull you over, to think you're a gang, to think that you're up to something bad, check your friends' pockets, whatever. Just do anything you possibly can all the time to make sure that you retain your freedom and your life. For Ed, who grew up in a drug stricken and crime stricken part of Chicago, it was his dad saying, basically, you're not allowed to hang out with the other kids here, even though they look like you, even though they live in the same place as you. You got to move by yourself. You got to move alone because big groups of Black kids, the numbers work against them. So you need to, if you want to be an outlier, if you want to live and if you want to have a living income, you're going to have to do everything on your own. That's the type of isolation that I think Black kids in all environments live with. And it does create such a friction when you're thrown into classrooms where you're the only Black kid, where you're thrown into jobs where you're the only Black person, but then you go into communities where you're surrounded by people who look like you, and you're expected, or you have to just be this sort of chameleon who can be comfortable alone, be comfortable in groups. You have this inner monologue working, this inner dialogue always, I guess it's a monologue. You have an inner monologue always happening in your head in every environment because you're so used to talking to yourself and talking yourself through things because you're so used to being alone. It's a mess. It's chaos. But it does acclimate you to the sound of your most honest voice. And I think being able to decipher your most honest voice from the noise and the signals all around you certainly benefits you as an executive. I would say it certainly benefits you in a high pressure job like being a doctor, a surgeon. I would say it's been very useful for me as a writer to be able to write down what I actually think versus what is a narrative or what is marketing. So that's what I mean when I talk about just the dissonance that is this isolation always on Black kids.
Is another isolation, comfort at isolation. That's one of the things that you identify as a form of Black magic. But there's also another gift that may not necessarily look like a gift, but being broke. This is something else that you discovered the upside of while actually writing this book. And I wonder how you can identify that as Black magic.
Yeah, and you know what? I struggle with the nomenclature for all of this. Like, I don't know if it's even fair to call these things gifts, right? They are coping mechanisms.
So skills, tactics. Yes, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. And I really cringe when people call these things advantages because I don't think that they are that. I think that, again, they are just tactics that can help us get closer to the lives that we want. But to answer the question, the median household income for white people and white families is over $100,000 now. I think it's around $4,000 for Black families. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to make something out of nothing. It's a life's work for many of us. It wasn't my experience in childhood, and I was fortunate for that. But when I got older, I did leave corporate America, and I did have very, very little. I had to cash out my 401k from Google. I had to pay taxes on it. Didn't know that was coming. A couple of things broke badly for me with some writing jobs that I thought I had that, people either didn't pay or they didn't pan out. And I looked around and I had no money. And when I had no money, I got super creative about how I was going to figure out how to make some money. And one of those ways was to write a book called Black Magic. So I say that to say resourcefulness to me is wanting what you already have. And that is the essence of this book, which is to say, if you don't have the money or the access to go get another degree, if you don't have a trust fund to spend or invest in your new business, look at what you've been developing and learning all along your whole life by navigating Blackness. There might be something there that you can use to start building your way out of whatever circumstance you're in.
I definitely want to get to some of these other questions here. It's out of context necessarily for what you're talking about, but Christine says, what kind of she asked if you interviewed people by a standard format. I can see from reading it that you did not, that you was in fact, you're a really great interviewer from one interviewer to another.
Thank you.
Really, really responsive. So maybe this question, where did you usually interview people?
I interviewed people all over. I interviewed a few people in their homes. I interviewed people in cars driving around what cities they lived in. I interviewed many people over the phone and over Skype. I interviewed people in all different types of environments, wherever I could catch them, to be honest, because a lot of these people were busy. Some people did interviews from conference rooms at work. It was all over the place.
Nettie asks, have you ever noticed that the diversity attempts generally include the same people of color who were on many other boards, organizations, because there was not a real attempt to get to learn about, interact with people of a different culture? People, organizations called SAFE.
I don't know that I have noticed that, but it does make sense to me. I think nepotism and inertia are the most powerful forces in corporate decision making. So it doesn't surprise me to hear that.
There are a lot of people who are curious about Google, so I'm going to try and get to some of those. But I'm curious about, you wrote much of this book in 2020, right?
I wrote much of it in 2020 and 2019. Yeah.
Okay. So 2020, I'm thinking this is when Ahmaud Arbery was gunned down here in Georgia by white vigilantes, and George Floyd suffocated by a cop's knee on his neck, and Breonna Taylor killed in her bed, Rayshard Brooks, so many others. And this is a time when millions of people marched in calls for racial reckoning. So you talked about the forthrightness that people talked about their experience. So what was it like for you to witness some truly heavy, painful conversations about identity and detachment and belonging, along with the triumphs and wisdom and creativity, with all of this going on in the background?
I think that 2020, I think that it made this book in that when last summer occurred, I felt such a rush of urgency. And in fact, we pushed the book up because of that urgency. And I felt such raw emotion and in some ways such helplessness to do anything besides use this book as a tool to offer hope, to offer a venting mechanism, to offer a space for honesty. During that summer, I wrote something that was probably the most raw and visceral piece of writing I had ever written, which was a letter, so to speak, to some of my white friends who were reaching out at the time that those atrocities occurred. And it was me saying, no more empty pleasantries. If you want to help, here are some ways that you can do so boldly, and that will require real sacrifice. And that piece was published in the New York Times, and people responded with fervor. And that showed me I needed to go back through every single page in my book and take out anything that was equivocating, anything that was softening the blow of the message, anything that was going to dilute the seriousness and the honesty in the book's message. So I think that last year called for, but also transformed this book.
The name of that op-ed, by the way, I don't need love texts from my white friends, that went, absolutely viral, talking about, you didn't need to hear from people saying, thinking about you while all this is going on, that there was much more to it. And that getting a text, and even more insultingly, you don't feel like you have to respond to this, was the context of, or the subject of this op-ed. And I think a lot of people there were a variety of responses, certainly, but on that subject, how do you hope that white readers or allies are going to interact with or take from this book?
I hope that they will have two moments of recognition. The first is to recognize that the Black people in their lives, friends, colleagues, subordinates, managers, teachers, that there is this whole giant layer of honesty that those people are withholding because they fear the backlash from said ally. And the second thing I want them to recognize is that just by having made it to the other side of your cubicle or your pitch desk or your house or whatever it is that you're running into these people, that they have navigated such an unfair and such an uncompromising system to get there, that they are superheroes.
Mhm.
They are tremendously adept and thoughtful and brave just for having made it into the same place that you are. So see them and invest in them and partner with them and promote them if you want your business to thrive.
I think somebody in your book tells you that Superman didn't know he was Superman the minute he was born, right?
Yeah.
That there's a sense of power develops over time and through that experience. And the people that you spoke to, they're adults who've worked through their identities. And any takeaways for you on how to best communicate these lessons to kids working through their own identities? Carla asked something similar. If you were mentoring or have a Black child, how would the talk go? How would you communicate this? I'm sorry, the talk is something separate. So let's deal with this question first. How would you communicate the kind of lessons you heard in superpowerness that you heard from the people that you spoke with?
Yeah, I've been getting pictures of friends' babies with this book, and it's the most joy that I feel from this entire experience of publishing my first book is seeing people who are 30 years younger than me, babies, really, like with this book. I think the best way to communicate these lessons to them is honestly and directly and as they are. Kids are really smart. Babies are really smart. Kids are awesome at receiving information and knowing what to do with it. It is going to be hard to process. It is going to make them scared. It is going to require more parenting and more mentorship on your part. It's going to create work for you, to be honest. But that's, I think that's the job. I'm not a parent, but that's my observation. Um,
How about
you
to
know,
Carla's question? If you were mentoring or have a Black child, how would the talk go for you? Would it be the same that your dad gave you?
Yeah, it would be. It would be cause and effect. It wouldn't, I think when kids rebel, it's because they don't understand a cause and effect relationship. When my dad made it clear to me that the consequences if you don't follow this is or are that you could die or you could go to jail, it was easy for me to follow those rules. And I did. I certainly rebelled in other areas and I resisted and I made other dumb decisions. But when kids know stakes, when people know stakes, I think they can make good decisions.
You know, even if somebody understands trauma, how it's internalized, and the things that you learned hearing other people and also in your own life,
Yeah.
there are lingering effects if you grow up internalizing whiteness as the standard and all the energy as you talked about that it takes to look good from the outside. But this doesn't go away. And for you, you write about in the book this kind of showing up as shame, even when you had tremendous success to celebrate. I wonder if you could just talk about that story and where you were at with that now.
Yeah. So to be specific, I sold my first TV show to BET, which is a network that makes Black shows for Black people. And it was such a victory for me, for one, because I had some money in my pocket, but even greater than that, like this was my goal. My dream was I'm going to leave corporate America and I'm going to be a writer and I'm going to do it at a high level. I'm going to sell a show to a real network. And I did that. And what followed was a feeling, a rush of disappointment in myself because Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and every network you can think of had turned me down. And the only one that accepted me was the Black one. And that is oftentimes the experience of exalting everything that is white and neglecting everything that is Black, that even I, as a Black person, can be guilty of. And so I think that's really the book, which is don't focus so much on being good at things that people tell you are the real skills, are the real hard tactical skills, and neglect these things that you've been developing your entire life, those are really valuable too.
What do you think now? Where are you on your theory of black magic after all these conversations with people who you were kind of testing it out?
I think it's real if you believe it. I think it's real if that belief drives action for you. Um, I think that we as Black people need to examine how all the ways that we are being led to believe that we're not good enough to build things that are prominent, and not good enough to build things that can be lasting and can be revenue generating and can support other things that we build. I know I believe in it. I think I'm walking in that belief. And more than anything, I'm curious to see if that holds up, and my story will be its own testament to whether or not it's real.
Well, Chad, I really want to thank you for talking about black magic with us tonight. I appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Chad Sanders' new book is called Black Magic: What Black Leaders Learned from Trauma and Triumph. We encourage you to purchase the book from a local bookseller. Ours is Acapella Books. There's a link at the Atlanta History Center website and also in the chat on your screen. And we really want to thank you for tuning in tonight. There's a lot more coming up. Next Tuesday, February 9th, Lisa Cross Smith talks with Gail O'Neill about her new book, This Close to Okay. And on Wednesday, the 10th, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms herself is going to be talking to Anna Malika Tubbs about her new book, Three Mothers. There is a full schedule and Zoom links. You can visit the atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you so much for your questions, for being here tonight. And thank you again to Chad Sanders.
Thank you.